And now we're very honored to be joined by Jeff Parsley. Jeff is the Global Group Chairman and Practice Leader for SRK Consulting. He's a professional geologist, and he's an experienced mine closure strategist and regulatory specialist. And in the ESG environment that we are finding ourselves in, which is a great thing, of course, this is increasingly a very front of mind issue for all of us in the industry and all stakeholders. Jeff has an extensive global experience assisting clients and governmental organizations in developing closure-related corporate standards, regulatory policies, and guidance documents. He's a graduate of Dartmouth College. He has nearly 40 years of experience, including 30 years in mine closure, and he serves as a global group chairman and practice leader for SRK Consulting. Jeff will serve as the moderator for our thought leadership panel titled Beginning at the End. Jeff, I will pass it over to you, and I'll allow you to introduce your panelists.
Hello. There we go. Hello, Anthony. Today, we actually are going to talk a bit about the social side of mine closure. There have been a lot of conversations, conferences, papers and whatnot on the topic of technical closure, but today we're going to try and look at the other side of it, the socioeconomic side. And it was interesting when we were arranging this particular panel discussion. Originally, I think thinking was it would be at the end because it was about closure, but one of the points we want to get across today is that actually closure needs to be thought about at the beginning. So instead, we ended up with one of the first slots in the symposium. So during the last 3 or 4 decades, the mining industry has closed a number of mines or portions of mines. And in that process, we've learned a lot about the technology of mine closure. Some of that knowledge has been gained through successes and some through failures. Regardless, we've applied sound science and engineering to many of the technical challenge of closure. And as a result, we've made significant progress in solving many of those aspects. However, although the evaluation of socioeconomic impacts of mining operations have been required for decades in a number of jurisdictions, it really was only the release of the Mine Minerals and Sustainable Development Project Report in 2002 that raised our awareness of the socioeconomic impacts of mine closure. And then the release of ICMM's Mine Closure Toolkit in 2008 added to this awareness of what we were calling at the time social closure. Now, the social closure is something that I've been discussing with colleagues, including some of my panelists here, for many years, but I always found that terminology confusing and imprecise. And last year, ICMM released the revised mine closure practice guide. And I feel that we finally have a more descriptive term for what we've been trying to express for nearly 20 years. Socioeconomic transitioning, which is the process of transitioning a community, or it could be a region or even a country, from a mining economy to a post-mining economy. And that includes all the social and economic aspects that involves. So what we're going to try and do on this panel today is unpack some aspects of mine closure, of the socioeconomic transitioning part of mine closure and how that integrates with the overall good practice in mine closure. So today I am joined with 3 panelists who have experience in mine closure governance, and particularly in socioeconomic transitioning. I've also had the privilege of working on mine closure projects with all 3 of these panelists. First of all, we have Boubacar Bokum, who is a leading mining specialist with the World Bank. He has 28 years of experience in the public and private mining sectors, and he holds both a master's degree in mining engineering and economics and an MBA. At the World Bank, he has been leading operational activities on mineral policies, governance, transparency, institutional capacity strengthening, and facilitating dialogue and interaction between governments, the private sector, and civil society. We also have Kevin D'Souza, who is the Vice President of Security, Sustainability, and Environment for Centerra Gold, based out of Toronto. After graduating nearly 30 years ago from the Royal School of Mines in London, he's worked in a variety of leadership roles, including direct experience with remote communities and indigenous groups in over 50 countries. Kevin's also worked extensively on mining-related human rights and sustainable development programs for some major NGOs and international funding institutions. And finally, we also have Charlene Wrigley. She is the Group Sustainable Development Manager for Goldfields in Johannesburg. And she leads the Goldfields Integrated Mine Closure Practice. She has 20 years of experience in the industry and sustainable development experience throughout the different phases of the mine life cycle, with a focus on integrating sustainable closure activities into current business and stakeholder processes. So, as we get started, I would like to first talk a little bit about mine closure governance framework, since the mine closure process is typically driven by what's required by laws or governance frameworks. And although we see corporate policy driving good practice in mine closure, particularly in countries that lack a good mine closure governance framework, the best results in mine closure are come in those jurisdictions with good governance frameworks. So in the last 30 years or so, many mining jurisdictions have either developed or modified their closure governance framework, and this seems to be accelerating in recent years. This is particularly true in some of the former Soviet states and in Africa. And organizations like the World Bank and the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals, Metals, and Sustainable Development are routinely asked by these governments to assist them. So I'm going to throw this out to the whole panel. If you were working with a government to develop a mine closure governance framework, what would you consider the key requirements of good mine closure governance framework? Anybody want to take that one? Boubacar?
I'll start. Jeff.
Oh, okay, Charlene, jump in.
Let me jump in. Jeff, I think as we learn more about integrated mine closure planning and our practices as an industry shift from a more biophysical approach to a more socioeconomic and social transitioning approach, we realize the importance of engaging with all our stakeholders, government, our host communities, our own people, our employees of the business, our organized labor within the business, even our shareholders. So I think an important governance framework needs to understand how important stakeholder engagement is, and not just your typical host community engagement that people may think is one of the key elements of integrated mine closure planning. So I would encourage governments or any governance framework to consider the integrated nature and the broad nature of your varied stakeholders that need engagement in order to plan effectively.
Okay. Boubacar, I think you had something you wanted to say.
Right. Maybe I can add to that really a few elements that are really important, starting with the requirement to prepare a plan itself, a closure plan. And with that, a number of things that come to play, including, properly and accurately costing that plan, making sure that the financial assurance elements are...
Hey, Boubacar,
yes.
Boubacar, we're getting a lot of noise over your microphone. I'm having trouble hearing you.
Okay. Is it better?
Yeah.
Great. So I was talking about the preparation of a plan, the definition of what is required in terms of costing for that plan, the periodicity of reviews of the plans and the costs, and a whole host of elements in terms of what is it that is required in terms of post-closure land use. So having really a clarity of requirements, a clarity of the methodologies, and a clarity of the practices that are acceptable are all good elements to have to avoid, improperly closed minds.
Kevin, you have anything you want to add to that?
I think we've covered it really. From a government point of view, there's been a preoccupation, as you know, Jeff, with the environmental side of things, the chemical and physical stability. And I think as an industry, we're getting better at that. We still some way to go, we're getting better, but we've got to help governments understand that a closure framework has to go to what Charlene says, to really understand the people aspects and the subject of this panel. I think things like, as you said, proper land use planning, elements like traditional knowledge. And one of the key things I think a governance framework should have is understanding from the beginning what relinquishment criteria we should all be working toward, because that's something we seldom understand. And we've got this idea of closure, but having proper relinquishment criteria in place, agreed between, as Charlene Boubacar says, governments and the future custodians of the land, whoever they be, and the company is important.
Okay. Boubacar, your work for the World Bank is a lot of that's in developing nations. What do you see as the biggest concerns that governments of those nations have with respect to mine closure? Are there some common themes there?
Yes, I'd say really maybe one theme that can be unpacked, the sustainability dimension. As Kevin was putting it a few minutes ago, until recently, it was much more on the environmental side of it, how to deal with, the rehabilitation, remediation, and the revegetation, and all of, taking care of the old installations and so on. But increasingly, I guess, because of two factors, the socioeconomic dimensions and the fact that a number of countries have seen ghost towns or towns and communities whose well-being had been impacted negatively by the closure of mines, increasingly you have this dimension of what is it that partners, and I'm really insisting on the term partners here, being the companies, the government, and communities need to do together to make sure that the community's well-being are not heavily impacted negatively at the end of the mine. So, the worry is really on those two dimensions. And one of the critical questions is really how to go from the worry to put in place the mechanisms, the capacities, and the framework to make sure that proper action are taken by partners to enable, continued well-being of communities after closure.
Okay, thank you. Boubacar and Kevin, both of you have worked in and are working in former Soviet states. And my experience has been that there are a number of factors that are unique to those countries. What are your thoughts on that? Are there factors that are fairly unique to the former Soviet states that we don't see elsewhere?
Yeah, perhaps I could say. I mean, to Boubacar's point, the whole thing about developing countries or that, having been born in the UK, we see this in the northern parts of the UK when the coal industry sort of came to a demise in the 80s. But looking at the FSU states, perhaps I would say it's the negative social and environmental legacy of the former Soviet abandoned mines, including especially things like uranium mine tailings. These sort of things are very prevalent in the mind of governments and host communities. Hence, I think it's very important, and we keep saying this, to ensure sort of proactive and meaningful engagement throughout the iterative closure processing planning process. We've got to really ensure that stakeholders are fully informed and that their concerns, aspirations, and values and expectations are properly addressed in the closure plans. This is, and I think we're going to talk about it later, much easier said than done. Just to give you an example, in Centera, we formulated a special sort of social transitioning impact assessment that we used in Mongolia some years ago when we were still present there, and more recently in Kyrgyzstan, to really try and delve down and not rely on just assumptions towards closure, but to properly identify those socioeconomic risks that are particularly acute, shall I say, in places like the FSU.
Okay.
I think maybe in addition to what Kevin has said, if in the West, a project proponent tend to have a set of requirements that are well defined in the laws, regulations, and practice, the former Soviet Union countries, because of the system from which they are coming, essentially were in a situation where the state was the miner, was taking care of the communities, and was also supposed to take care of closure and post-closure issues, and the state or that system had moved on. And really a number of those countries, from Kazakhstan to Kyrgyzstan to Caucasian countries, just to name a few, are in fact transitioning, from that old system they have into sort of the Western system, if one can call it like that. And with the transition, all sets of laws, practices, and approaches are evolving. And in addition to that, a number of places had cities that were specifically built around mines. So what they call mono-cities in that part of the world. So the notion and the issue of socioeconomic transition or just transition is even more prominent there. And often the question becomes one of whether there are really other economic opportunities at all around those cities, and how to go from what is a mono-city to a community that may continue to live well after the mine has closed and to live, decently.
Thank you, Bubakar. All right. One of the things I want to touch on, and I mentioned it in my introductory comments. In his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Dr. Stephen Covey's second habit is begin with the end in mind. And I know that this principle appears in most mine closure guidance documents and many of the mine closure governance frameworks. Certainly in my work, we try and start that way. I have a question for all of us, and actually we're going to take a survey at the end of your comments here and ask the audience the same thing. How effective are we, the mining industry, at applying Dr. Covey's second habit to mine closure? How well do we think about it before we go out there and design and build one of these things? Anybody want to jump into that one?
Sure, then I'll start on that one then. Look, over the past few decades, I think between us, we've unfortunately got nearly well over a century of experience here. But I think over the last few decades, I've witnessed the evolution, I think we all have, of determining, of a changing process for post-closure land use. But it's still, unfortunately, a very rare occurrence to see any form of closure visioning done as early as we're now advocating. I mean, despite this sensible notion of considering post-closure land use during the initial feasibility stage, the reality is just too many distractions, timelines, and resource constraints at that early stage. Internal talk about closure tends to be somewhat suppressed, during the euphoria of project development and construction. And I think the reality is that most companies are too busy thinking about maximizing localization, employment, procurement, and the thought of broaching the subject of closure with stakeholders before you've even put a shovel in the ground, it just seems counterintuitive. I think we usually have a reasonable idea of the key components for closure, the chemical and physical stability, but we simply don't spend enough time on the less tangible social transitioning piece to look at that closure early on. I think also in my experience, I can't think of a single instance where a life of mine plan hasn't changed and hence required changes to the closure plan. Add to this mix the evolving cultural and community expectations during the life of mine for post-closure land use means that in theory it'd be great to really do this at the sort of pre-feasibility stage, but in reality we haven't quite moved there in the industry.
Okay, Charlene, you want to add to that? You're nodding your head.
Yes, so I think well said, Kevin. I think we're getting better at it as an industry, and I think elements of mine closure are being considered in the early stages. For example, maybe final landforms, where you are looking at co-disposal of waste or waste management, landforms, input disposal. Those kind of options are being considered earlier and earlier. However, Kevin's point is very valid. A lot changes during the life of the operation, and people know this, so it's sometimes hard to plan. I think the area that probably needs the greatest amount of impetus is without a doubt the socioeconomic transitioning component. And Kevin's point is valid. There's a lot going on in the beginning, which makes it a difficult piece to tackle. Well,
I don't want to get stuck on this because I want to move on to socioeconomic transition, but I do have a follow-up. It just occurred to me. How important or how much of an influence does the fact that all of the economic analysis done is based on an NPV analysis? And even if you've got $100 million plus in closure costs, if that doesn't occur for 30 or 40 years in the mine life, it becomes very insignificant on the NPV. So I'm curious, do you think this also influences the importance of mine closure planning at the development stage?
I think NPV is an important financial planning tool. I think it may not be the best tool to understand the true impact of closure costs of closure. I have yet to find a better tool though. I'm not a financial expert myself, but I haven't found something that could work better. But I think that would be aspirational, or certainly worth looking at going forwards. I think NPV is not perhaps the right tool to truly understand the costs right now.
Well said. Okay, let's dive into the more socioeconomic transitioning discussions. First of all, all of the best closure governance frameworks and good practice guides advocate mining companies engage with affected stakeholders early in the closure planning process and continue to engage throughout the mine life. In my experience, it can be very difficult to engage in a really productive dialogue about mine closure at the beginning of the mine life cycle. So what has been any of your experiences regarding the typical response of stakeholder engagement regarding mine closure specifically, and early in the mine life, and how does that change through the mine life cycle?
I think we at the World Bank have been really involved in supporting a lot of developing countries in putting in place a framework to attract investment. And the initial sort of the focus is that, of course, you need that. But then at that point of time is also where you put in the closure requirement and so on and so forth. It's really, really difficult to have people to think about attracting investment, and especially when it is successful and new companies and new projects are coming to talk about closure. And not only to talk about closure, but to talk about socioeconomic transitions for things that may happen in 10, 20, 30 years, depending on the types of commodities. And I guess the question becomes one of really how does one almost move a little bit the goalposts in the approach that had been taken so far, which is attract investment to becoming attract investment for catalyzing extractives for development, and really to come to what Kevin was talking about in terms of local content and employment. Really think of it not of all these elements, not as discrete elements that are applied, at the initial stage or development phase or operational phase, but something that becomes a guiding approach. And while all this local content and so on are developed, that people are also working on non-mining employment and income generation, to build communities' resilience as we go, and to make sure that as time comes where people listen a little bit more on closure requirements, be it on the technical or socioeconomic dimensions, that there are built-in capacities and capabilities to move on and make sure that post-closure things are not as they are in many places now.
Maybe I could add there too. on the stakeholder engagement, excuse me. Sorry, I should have commented to Jeff on the shorts and blazer. That's a good start there. On engagement, ideally, I think we all know this. It'd be great to do this during the feasibility stage, especially when we're conducting the social baseline, the impact assessments. You know, we could more easily assess pre-mining land use, look to the future. This good practice theory makes common sense. But yet again, you know, practicalities come, and I've seldom seen this happen, and it's easier said than done. Look, whether I've been working in the highlands of New Guinea, Mongolia, Western Sahara, or now in BC, communities simply don't want to hear the word or anything to do with closure early on, especially recognizing the likely local economic decline, migration, and other negative impacts. So it's a very, very sensitive subject to bring up too early on in the process, no matter what we as practitioners think or the industry thinks, just the practicalities of dealing with human nature. But we as companies and the industry, I think, have a responsibility to proactively ensure our engagement is not just about the easy things of promoting the positive here and now, but consistently reiterating the message of inevitable closure, getting people used to the idea that closure is coming, not that it's something in the distance, but it's coming. And we've got to work both with governments and communities to ensure we've got a longer runway to doing this. Because I think in the past, we've all put it off to the end of thinking the last 3 years we can run and do this, but we've got to increase that runway now.
Okay. Well, let's move on to some of the basic topics of socioeconomic transitioning. And the first one I want to tackle, because again, beginning with the end in mind, post-mining land use. Now, ICMM's Good Practice Guide that came out last year points out that you need to do that. You need to define a post-mining land use or post-mining land uses as part of the critical development for a good closure plan. And specifically, they say, particularly the definition of both closure vision and objectives. Now, the IFC World Bank Environmental Health and Safety Standards for mining states that mine closure plans should be designed that after use of the site is beneficial and sustainable to the affected communities in the long term. So Charlene or Kevin, or both of you, in your experience, what tools have you found most effective in developing post-closure land uses for mine sites and infrastructure?
Thank you, Jeff. There are obviously very strong and important biophysical considerations in your post-closure mining land uses. Obviously, you'd have to look at what the land is able to do post-closure, especially if it's been highly altered by your mining activities and cannot easily be returned to something close to its original state, which is not always the desirable outcome in any case. So there's a lot of scientific, engineering, and basic tools or important tools that can help you understand what is possible before you can even decide on an alternative. From a socioeconomic point of view, I think one of the important tools is your people. They give you a very strong indication of what their expectations or needs or requirements are post-closure. Whether those are achievable, cost-effective, desirable for other parties and stakeholders, this is a balancing act after all, is certainly a different discussion that needs to be considered. But I think your relationships with your people is part of what helps determine it. And as we've picked up, it's actually very difficult to do, especially early on, which is where you really need to set the scene for how you manage your land going forwards. Governments, of course, also give direction and guidance in their legislation and in their engagement, which can help a lot, especially since in many instances, they too take responsibility for the land post-closure.
Kevin, to add on to what Charlene said, how do you go about ensuring that what you come up with is practical? You know, in some cases, it's what the expectations of stakeholders are isn't even possible, let alone practical. But I mean, how do you account for that?
I mean, if we get to that, I think on the tools as well, I would say we don't have to get a new toolbox here. We don't have to go down to Home Depot and think we need a whole lot of tools. We've got a lot of tools within the sustainability teams, you know, making sure you reinforce the fundamentals of the obligation registers from the beginning. You make sure you've got a good grievance mechanism and stakeholder engagement. This, from day one, from exploration throughout, will help you. To try and answer your second point there, I think this is really, as we all know, we overuse the word, but it's so important, the iterative consultation and planning process for understanding land use. I think it's best to start by identifying the key physical aspects that are required to meet a particular post-closure land use. This could be water criteria, physical stability, or public safety issues. and then start eliminating the alternatives that are just not possible based on, and I think I mentioned it earlier, that that relinquishment criteria. So if you start early with your government stakeholders to understand the relinquishment criteria, what you agree is criteria to leave, you can start eliminating ideas about land use and work that way together. I think that the same applies about infrastructure as well, when people have been asked, to leave infrastructure behind.
Thanks, Gavin. One of the things that I've been asked by mining companies and governments when I've worked with them, it relates to the roles and responsibilities in mine closure, and particularly what happens to the mine afterwards. So if a mine site or a portion of a mining operation will be repurposed and redeveloped, at what point does the mining company's responsibility for that after use end? For example, should a mining company be responsible for funding and or maintaining the redevelopment? Anybody want to jump in on that one?
Let me try. I think that, this is really a critical question in my view regarding the current focus on just transition or socioeconomic transition. It really, it will have a cost. So as much as the cost of environmental remediation and so on, had been settled, the question of communities' well-being, in my mind, really is a question that every government needs to be thinking about hard. And some of the resources that are generated by the mine in its operation ought to be used to sustain the lives of the communities. This being said, so there is a role for all parties, I would say, but there is also a role of thinking more creatively, if I can call it like that, than has been the past. It really is not necessarily only the key partners, communities, companies and governments. Invariably, you would find that there are a lot of bilateral, multilateral NGOs that also intervene in the same areas, in the same regions where mining is happening. So how to catalyze all of the efforts and make sure that they all converge, and that as the project goes, the lives of communities post-closure are thought through, that various skills, capabilities, and the resources are brought to bear to make sure that people don't wait until the last minute to try to deal with all of the issues that come with closure.
Thank you, Bubakar. Laura, could we have survey question B up, please? Basically, you're about to see something on your screen. How effective is the mining industry in collaborating with stakeholders to develop mine closure strategy and post-closure land uses? And we'll give you I don't think Laura's going to give us too much time.
Well, we'll wait till we get to a little bit more. There's great voting going on right now.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. Do we have some questions coming in? I apologize, I had to step away for a second to attend to my.
Well, we're not there. We've got a few more minutes here on the panel, and I want to tackle one last issue in particular. It looks like we've. Whoops, I lost the. Oh, there it is. Moderately good, 50%, not very. Well, I think that kind of agrees with what we've just all said. So it sounds like we're in agreement with the audience. One last issue before we go to questions. I would like to, and this is always, and I know you guys have all faced this. This is always the issue. The big issue is that obviously your employees, when they're laid off from a mining operation, if they have no other mining operation to go to, they're going to have to go look for a job. And given that the average salary of mining employees always exceeds national average salaries, what is realistic? What are realistic expectations in terms of replacing the direct and indirect economic benefits mining by replacing these jobs in other industries or whatnot. Anybody want to jump in on that one? It's always a tough one.
Maybe I could start then. Look, this is where the focus of the sustainability community relations folks has to be, and it should be from the onset of operations, in terms of ensuring that our social investments aren't just a philanthropic type, but really focusing on true economic projects. I mean, the good companies that are leading now are really focusing on diversifying local livelihoods, income generating opportunities, post-closure, all of this that builds, I think, as Biophysical says, that resilience to mine closure afterwards. But I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Jeff, by got to be realistic. We pride ourselves and promote that mining does pay well. So above national averages, so skilled employees are going to leave. They're going to out-migrate. So I think we just got to make sure our community investments, our projects really focus on as much as we can sustainability, but also understanding there will be some out-migration, and a mining company on its own, a government on its own, cannot stop economic migration between countries, across countries. That's something we really got to understand what's in our control. I'll give you a quick example. Our new mine in Turkey, which just received commercial production this month, has got a relatively short life of mine. And from the very beginning, all of our work in the community relations and with procurement and employment is all about understanding we're not going to be there as long as some other assets. And that's what we really focus on.
Okay. Anybody else? Charlene, you want to weigh in on that?
Yes. I think job replacement or an alternative economy is not a silver bullet. It is a fantastic aspiration, but I haven't seen many instances in the mainstream where this is actually being achieved, and it can easily be achieved. It's a very complex situation. And of course, we have lots of different local contexts. Yes, we may struggle really to be able to achieve that given some of the factors that Kevin himself mentioned right now. And to his point, I think what you do during your operations needs to prepare your host communities in particular for being able to be more self-sufficient and less dependent on the mining companies by the time social transitioning or mine closure occurs. They have to be able to be more competitive and be able to diversify their skills and offerings, and of course reduce their dependence on you. And I think this is really beginning with the end in mind, or operating with the end in mind, in that your, for example, host community procurement programs, such as the ones that Goldfields run, are really focused on building competitive advantage and strengthening our communities, being able to offer services beyond us so that they can be more self-sustaining after Goldfields transitions throughout, away, or whatever the issue may be. And I think your employment strategies can do the same. You can strengthen your communities to be better positioned for you. But you cannot rely on an alternate economy, I think, just appearing at the time of closure, because it's really, really complex and difficult to achieve.
Thanks, Charlene. Biophysical, do you have something short you want to add? We have a couple questions we need to answer.
Right. I mean, I would just add that maybe in addition to thinking about salaries, one can think about human development index in those communities, i.e., in lots of places, we just know mining tend to pay more than other sectors. So replacing those salaries by something other than extractives is rather challenging. But this being said, you know, all of the diversification, competitiveness building, and alternative livelihood and incomes, but thinking about the communities from broader sort of human development indexes and working on those could be part of resilience building.
Okay. Now, Laura, I understand we have a couple of questions.
Yeah, we do. Hi, Jeff, it's Anthony here. So I can read these out. We are starting to get a little bit up against the clock. So it might be best if maybe just one or two panelists responded to each of the questions. That way we can get to both of them. They're both excellent questions. Here's the first one. What are the panelists' thoughts regarding managing discussions around social transitioning in areas of conservation importance, particularly where such areas may already be under threat or in demand?
Charlene or Kevin, one of you want to take that one? Charlene smiling, she's ready.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. I feel that there we have some of our best opportunities or strongest opportunities. And where you have areas of conservation that are already under threat or in conflict, I think there's an opportunity to maybe look for shared value between the environment and the mining company, or the communities that are reliant on these spaces and the mining company and other stakeholders. But you have to start those conversations as soon as possible. And I think the most effective conversations come from the best relationships. So that comes back down to your engagement piece and building these relationships and building the capacity with your stakeholders to engage around them, around these areas in conflict.
Okay. Anthony, you said we had another one?
We do, yes. Starts off with a nice compliment. Great panel, Jeff. Thank you to all the participants. One key challenge that I find, and Charlene in passing alluded to this, is how to differentiate what communities want versus what communities need. Whose responsibility is it to define what is want and what is need, considering the post-mining transition?
That's a good question. Kevin, you're thinking. I can see that on your face.
I think there is only one answer to that, and that's the community. If anybody else thinks they can define what is the difference between want and need, that isn't in the community, and doesn't live in the community, they're in trouble, really. I mean, no consultant, no mining company, no government can really differentiate the two. We all think we can say, well, that community needs water, but what they really want is this. That's dangerous territory. So no matter what we as industry or experts think, listening and understanding the community and working with the community throughout to help them understand the difference between that is paramount. We have to avoid becoming paternalistic or worse, and really make sure the community takes charge of this. That's quite an important point.
Boubacar, how do the governments you work with understand this, that really that responsibility lies with the communities?
Well, I think it varies really, depending on places and countries. It's communities. This being said, I think where government could be helpful is to help communities in not only thinking short term, i.e., what they need immediately, which tend to be all sort of infrastructures, but thinking about the space, the location, the environment, thinking about a regional or local economic development plan where combining community wants and needs of the short term and economic possibilities and opportunities that may be there in the medium term, and working on those and working with the community as it becomes more apparent to all of them is where I see some complementarities going forward.
Thanks, Boubacar. Well, I guess we've run out of time, Anthony. I'd like to thank all the panelists. You guys were great. And I look forward to seeing you all when the craziness is over.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Boubacar. Thank you, Charlene. And thank you, Kevin. Kevin, nice to see you again. We did a panel together a few years back, I believe at U of T, I think that one was.
We did.
Always a pleasure to listen to you. That was excellent. I'd echo the comments of the individual who submitted that last question. Just a very excellent panel. Thank you for all of your time and all of your deep insights on such an important topic.